At the end of his career, in the late 1980s, Deleuze began to regroup and classify all the works he had ever written. On this occasion, he created a catalogue that was made of 11 entries. This list goes to show how Deleuze viewed the scope of his work. Of particular interest is a small text that he placed under the 10th rubric, and which was first written in the early 1950s. This short text is an early outline of the concept of repetition, and it manifests what we could call Deleuze's initial insight, his original intuition, which some 15 years later culminated in difference and repetition. Let us see how young Deleuze approaches this problem, because it can teach us a few precious things about his philosophy. Let's situate the text briefly. In the early 1950s, Deleuze was notoriously interested in David Hume, and when he was just 28 years old, he published Empiricism and Subjectivity, where he confronts empiricism with transcendental philosophy, thus preparing the method called transcendental empiricism. One of the foundational propositions of empiricism is this: the diversity of the given is exterior to the synthetic relations in which it enters. This means that to know something, I must synthesize it first, or put it in a relation with something else, almost like a comparison, without which I cannot know what a thing is. As Deleuze explains, there are three types of relations: contiguity, resemblance, and causality, which synthesize the things that are given to me in my perceptions. If I can recognize this thing as a sunset, it's because certain colors relate to certain shapes. In empiricism, this happens inside of a faculty that is called imagination, which in turn forms the subject. But Kant notoriously rejects this view. He says that even if you argue, as empiricism does, that the subject must be constituted or constructed in these syntheses, in order for there to be anything at all, anything perceptible, there must first be a pre-individual synthesis, that is, an automatic process that occurs before perception and that precedes it so as to ground imagination. In other words, Kant objects that you cannot postulate imagination just like that. You must explain it. This is what Deleuze explains in Empiricism and Subjectivity. He says, Kant reproaches Hume for having mistakenly raised the problem on this good terrain. The very way in which Hume posed the question, that is, his dualism, necessitated the notion that the relation between the given and the subject is an agreement between the subject and the given, of human nature and nature. But precisely, let us suppose that the given is not initially subject to principles of the same kind as those that regulate the connection of representations in the case of an empirical subject. In this case, the subject could never encounter this agreement, except in an absolutely accidental way. It would not even have the occasion to connect its representations according to the rules whose corresponding faculty it nevertheless possessed. As far as Kant is concerned, the problem must be reversed. We must relate the given to the subject, conceive the agreement as an agreement of the given with the subject, and of nature with the nature of reasonable beings. While for Hume there is no a priori synthesis required because subjects and objects are metaphysically united by a transcendent principle, Kant shows the necessity to ground imagination in a foundation that is not dogmatic and metaphysical, and therefore unexplainable, but which is transcendental. Transcendental in this context means that the synthesis must first explain why objects can be perceived at all. For Kant, the transcendent function, which grounds all syntheses, is the I think, the autoposition of the subject, which is a way for Kant to say that relations are fundamentally a process of interiorization, which occur in a subject and therefore determine its form. In so doing, Kant operates a considerable shift in philosophical thinking. Where Hume's problem was, how does the subject constitute itself in the given? Kant now asks, how can something be given at all to a subject? And his answer is that things must first be put in space and time. So Kant denies that the distinction between the subject and the given is original. Rather, there is a transcendental subject, which is not an individual conscience properly speaking, but rather what Kant calls a synthetic unit of apperception, which automatically puts things in space and time for the actual subject to be grasped. Imagination as a faculty is the product of this process. It is the reason why, with Kant, man replaces God at the center of the universe, and a finite transcendental process replaces an infinite metaphysical principle. In this context, young Deleuze intends to do two things. Against Kant, he would like to maintain Hume's view that the subject appears in the given as a habit. But against Hume, he would like to maintain Kant's transcendental synthesis. Rather than having a universal transcendental subject as the measure and arbiter of all apparitions, Deleuze defines a process of habit formation, or repetition, as the basis of all experience. This process implies not original identity, like a first principle or a pre-established harmony, but rather it explains how identities, principles, and harmonies are formed. Here is the difficulty for Deleuze. How can we explain an identity, which can only be known as a representation, without pre-existing representations, and which must also be identities? Otherwise they would be unintelligible. The intellect needs representations in order to explain things, so how can it explain representation itself? It seems like a daunting paradox, but this is where today's text becomes relevant. At first, it would seem that desert islands have nothing to do with this problem, but as Deleuze shows, they allow to formulate this paradox of representation in terms of a relation between two ways of thinking, mythology and science, which are proxies for empiricism and rationalism. From the scientific point of view, Deleuze explains, there are two types of desert islands, those that derive from continents and those that emerge out of the ocean. Similarly, from the mythological perspective, desert islands can either mean a retreat from civilization or a new departure. This is to say that these two ways of thinking, mythology and science, both explain things either in terms of something else, an island in terms of a continent or an idea in terms of an archetype, or they explain things as apparitions, emergence. But isn't it strange, Deleuze wonders, that even so we do not manage to grasp the thing itself, that we cannot reproduce the real movement by which desert islands are formed? Why is it that mythological thinking gets bored by scientific models, while science quickly debunks mythologies as fictions? Instead of opposing the scientific and the mythological, Deleuze explains, we need to shift our thinking and explain how things appear. We need to do so without presupposing a transcendental subject to which things appear. Therefore, we need to explain the desert island in terms of a consciousness of the movement which produced the island, such that through them, the island would in the end become conscious of itself, as deserted and unpeopled. In other words, the correct way to think a desert island is to think it in terms of how it appears to itself. Only so can scientific geography and mythology, understanding and imagination, be finally united and seize the thing as it is. However, this movement is only possible by right, de jure, but not in fact. If the island becomes aware of itself, it is always through us, the indefectible byproduct of this self-conscience that we call me. And so we never reach the pure archetypal or materially creative level. We remain stuck somehow in our individual perspective. It is kind of annoying. Are we condemned to be forever alienated from the world because of me? The only way to grasp being as such would be if we somehow imitate the movement of creation and manage to put mythological and scientific emergence in relation somehow. Fortunately, this is exactly what literature does. As Deleuze explains, literature is the attempt to interpret, in an ingenious way, the myths we no longer understand. At the moment we no longer understand them, since we no longer know how to dream them or to reproduce them. And if mythology and science have a common essence in literature, it's because literature is a process of repetition by which we reinterpret old myths. The essence that is revealed for a brief instant in this process of creation is as close as we will ever get to the desert island becoming self-aware, to the thing in itself. Because in the process of creation we have an overview over a whole world. As such, Deleuze explains, desert islands do not have an absolute origin, but a second origin, a second birth. How are we to understand this? This is to say that essence, in the sense of what can be known or what there is, reality itself, is not the foundation of thought, but rather it is its effect. If essence cannot be found in a perfect state of contemplation of an eternal idea, it can be seen briefly in the repetitive moments of creation that occur in literature. What other literary theme could illustrate this better than desert islands? What other literary theme is more well known? This second birth, the essence as an effect, is what Deleuze calls repetition, and what we are meant to understand is that essence can be seen briefly, and being itself grasped for a short while, within the process of creation, which we do by seizing the conditions of apparition of a thing in a back and forth between mythology and science, derivation and emergence. Reality is always found between the big categories in a brief instant of creation, which determines the passage from one to the other. Deleuze doesn't use the word yet, but this is what he later calls becoming. The reason why Deleuze opens his text with a back and forth between the imaginary and the rational views is precisely because essence is found in this movement, this passage between series. This is why he says the following: "The second origin is thus more essential than the first, since it gives us the law of repetition, the law of series, whose first origin gave us only moments." Interestingly, Deleuze uses the figure of the egg to illustrate this creative process by which we go beyond the given and find the law of a series. It is in this movement that we manage to transcend the dead end in which representation had put us. As he says in the last sentence of the text, "In the ideal of beginning anew, there is something that precedes the beginning itself, that takes it up to deepen it and delay it in the passage of time. The desert talent is the material of this something immemorial, this something most profound." Desert talents are, quite literally, and not just metaphorically, the immemorial, that which exists beyond the given. And this immemorial is the law that governs the passage between series. In turn, the immemorial appears as the interior space in which the repetition of contiguous series forms relations of resemblance and causality. In order to give way to this second birth, this process of repetition must become the repetition of difference. In this movement of back and forth, which is ever repeated, the cosmos becomes self-aware, and the self finally manages to forget itself for a little while. So the conditions of real experience, and not just possible experience, are met, or almost. Because now Deleuze must explain what difference consists in. It is the very theme that he will proceed to develop in his early studies of Bergson in the mid-1950s. And it is how we can finally explain representations without representations. Because the repetition of difference is precisely that which cannot be represented, that which can only become, and it is, therefore, authentic novelty. So this is in a few words Deleuze's first intuition, his point of departure as a young philosopher. I'm personally very fond of it because it shows a desire to grasp reality. It goes against all the stereotypical views that depict modern philosophy as blasé and nihilistic, actively trying to deny truth and reality. As we can see, it's just the opposite. It's a way to account for truth, in spite of the formidable paradoxes that we encounter in representation. I'd like to address a special thank you to all my awesome patrons, whose support I immensely appreciate. For now, thank you all for watching, and see you soon.